Please be seated. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." About 35 miles north of Tel Aviv, on the banks of the Mediterranean Sea, are the ruins of the ancient port city of Caesarea Maritima. Rebuilt by Herod the Great, king of Judea under the Romans, the city was a marvel. To allow for ships to come into the rocky harbor, Herod had a huge artificial port built. It was the first of its kind in the ancient world, made with hydraulic concrete, which is concrete that hardens underwater. The ancient historian Josephus tells us that Herod adorned the city with the most sumptuous palaces. And one modern scholar writes that it is almost impossible to imagine the splendor of the city. Sidewalks tiled with mosaics, long rows of columns lining the main streets, and the tons of marble imported from Egypt and Italy used to build bathhouses. Archaeologists have even found the fragments of porcelain all the way from China. Here was a cosmopolitan city worthy of the name that Herod the Great gave to it, Caesarea, named after his patron, Caesar Augustus. By the year 6 AD, the Romans had made this city the provincial capital of Judea. Pontius Pilate lived here. And it is from this port city that the Apostle Paul set sail for Rome to appeal his imprisonment to Caesar. Now, Paul was a highly educated Pharisee, and he was also a Roman citizen. He had spent years as a traveling evangelist and church planter. So it's not unreasonable to think that Paul had the education and life experience to make this journey from Caesarea Maritima to Rome without too much trouble. Tradition tells us that Paul will die in Rome, martyred during Nero's persecution. Now, church tradition also tells us that the Apostle Peter was also martyred in Rome during Nero's persecution. And if so, it is likely he would have also boarded a ship from Caesarea Maritima. But unlike Paul, Peter, I think, would have found the journey more difficult. Imagine Peter, an uneducated fisherman whose first language is Aramaic. He knows no Latin. He has never lived in a city like Rome. And standing on the shores of Caesarea Maritima, he would be looking out into the Mediterranean Sea. It looks nothing like the Sea of Galilee, along whose banks he grew up. Galilee is a small lake, one that is small enough that you can see across from it, from one shore to the opposite. And the Mediterranean, when you look out on it, is nothing but water all the way to the horizon. What could have pushed Peter to say yes to this journey, to board a ship and to head toward that teeming and chaotic city of Rome? In the Episcopal Church, the office of bishop is much more than just an administrative job. It's much more than someone who oversees the priests and the deacons, more than someone who runs a diocese. For us, the office of bishop is a sign of the Church's Catholicity and its apostolicity. That is, the bishop is a sign that we belong to the universal Church. We are a Catholic Church. The bishop is also a sign that our Church has a historical foundation, going all the way back to the apostles. We are an apostolic church. We didn't start just yesterday. And one way we acknowledge this history is that every bishop in our church has been consecrated by other bishops, who themselves were consecrated by other bishops, in an unbroken line going all the way back to the apostles. We call this unbroken line apostolic succession. Clifton Daniel III is the 922nd bishop in the Episcopal Church. And our very first bishop, Samuel Seabury, was consecrated by bishops in the Scottish Episcopal Church, who were part of this line of apostolic succession, going all the way back to the Apostle Peter, the first bishop of Rome. What makes a bishop of the Church? A sign of our Catholicity and apostolicity from the beautiful Diocese of East Carolina. Say yes to a journey that brings him to this teeming and chaotic New York City. In our reading today from Acts, we hear that Paul has a vision of a man pleading with him to come to Macedonia to help them. And it is this vision that compels Paul, for the first time in world history, to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to Europe. Now, this word vision can be translated literally as something that is seen. But I think before a vision can be seen, it has to be given. It has to first be given because a vision has to come outside of ourselves. And if you think about it, I think this makes sense. Because if we could dream up a vision, it wouldn't really be one. It would just be one of the many thoughts that bubble up and swirl around in our minds. But a vision comes to us from outside of us. A vision comes from God, though we never could have imagined it for ourselves. A vision is the future that God intends for our lives, that God allows us to have a glimpse of. And although Paul had wanted to preach the gospel in Asia Minor, in the region where he was born, he was prevented from doing so. And instead, God sent him a vision that propelled him to preach the gospel in Europe. And although Peter was a leader of the church in Jerusalem, although his roots were in Capernaum, along the Sea of Galilee, although he spoke no Latin and was an uneducated fisherman, the vision of preaching the gospel in the heart of Rome, in the heart of what he calls Babylon in one of his letters, came to him from God. And that vision propelled him to board a ship at Caesarea Maritima and head to Rome, where he would be martyred. And for our dean, there was a vision that came to him. It was in the form of an insistent call from the members of the Standing Committee of the Diocese of Pennsylvania. Would he be interested in leaving his comfortable and familiar position in East Carolina, the diocese that raised him and formed him, where his roots run very deep, to leave that diocese and spend a few years in Pennsylvania as the provisional bishop, to lead a diocese that was coming apart, riven by conflict and dysfunction. So much conflict that the bishop and the standing committee were suing one another in court. He said no. They called back. He said no again. And they kept calling until he finally said yes. Until God gave him a glimpse of the vision that God had for his life. He said yes, which set him on a journey that eventually led to his coming to our cathedral to be our dean. In the closing lines of her poem, Summer Day, Mary Oliver writes, I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do? with your one wild and precious life. I love this poem, especially those last lines. But at the risk of sounding like a priest, I think in my life, and in the lives of so many I know, our human plans for our wild and precious life cannot compare to the vision that God has for our lives. As the prayer book translates the verse from Ephesians, glory to God whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Like the Apostle Peter, standing on the shores of Caesarea Maritima, staring out into that endless blue water of the Mediterranean Sea, preparing himself for his journey to Rome. Or like Paul, receiving the vision of a man from Macedonia to preach the gospel on a new continent. Or like our dean, getting a call every day from members of a different diocese, asking him to come and lead them back to health after years of divisive conflict. God has a vision for our wild and precious lives that is so much more than we can ask or imagine. And when we say yes to that vision, who knows in what strange and far-off places we may find ourselves.